Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show where we talk all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. We're going to start off by looking at an item as we get back to where we left off in Cainhurst. Wrist of the Holy One, one of the special materials necessary for a holy chalice ritual. A piece of the Holy Ones, sacrifices of the healing church made for the purpose of its exploration. The defenders of the ruins are said to have displayed an odd agitation at the death scent of the Holy Ones. By means of the additive rite, death scent offering, some of the defenders will display agitation. They are more dangerous than usual, but should become the subjects of a special hunt. Now, clearly, the first thing that stands out here is the section in the middle of this item description, which the official translation does not seem to cover. So right at the start of the episode, we're looking at another important discrepancy with an interesting history. Because as we've seen before, this is a particular set of lines that did receive an official translation at one point, but which seems to have been phased out before being implemented into the game. So, before anything else, let me read back my more literal version of the line in question as I display what would have been the official translation. The defenders of the ruins are said to have displayed an odd agitation at the death scent of the Holy Ones. This is, in my opinion, some exceptionally well-formulated and evocative phrasing. But before I get into that, I should note that unlike some unused versions of the official translation, the Japanese text here is different as well, better mirroring the unused English. This suggests to me that we're probably missing some interim step, that there was this early version of the item in Japanese that got translated, a possible update that matched the existing official English translation, and finally the Japanese version we see in the game now, which reincorporates some of the old text that didn't manage to get reincorporated on the English side of things. Fortunately, at least in practical terms, this doesn't seem like a huge change to me. Purely from the perspective of conveying information, what this extra bit of text is doing is repeating what's in the final section of the Japanese. So, even though we're missing a line discussing how the Watchers are thrown into excitement when they catch the scent of a dead Holy One, we are still told in mechanical terms that the foul smell of a sacrificed saint invigorates the Watchers. This isn't to say there's nothing lost in the omission. I'd much rather have that line about Watchers reveling uncontrollably when they catch a waft of dead saints, but I don't think this is on the level of, say, mismatching the implementation of the text on Ludwig's weapons. Speaking of revelry and excitement, though, there is one other point I'd like to make here that applies to all of the text that we've looked at so far. The original term for what happens to the defenders, or watchers, of the chalice dungeons is takaburi, which my Daijisen Japanese dictionary defines as a state of excitement or heightened emotions. There's a second definition about arrogance, but given the in-game effect, which is to increase enemy stats, the first definition seems to be the one intended here. But even with that established, you'll note that this term has been translated in 3 different ways. The official text as it exists in the game has it as invigorates, while the unused text speaks of the enemies reveling uncontrollably, and my more literal version uses the word agitation. Given the stat boosting effect, invigorates is probably the most gameplay relevant term, but by showing these alternative takes, I think you can see a connection to the theme of madness here, since we're creating an emotional disturbance in the Watchers. And speaking of emotionally disturbing, let's take a look at our next item. Red jelly, one of the materials necessary for a holy chalice ritual. These are failed inhuman babies that succumb to death in various places throughout the underground ruins. Not the most pleasant description, and not one that lends itself to a cheerful discussion either. Still, there is a bit of a potential difference to be found here that I think revolves around the Japanese term narisokonai. This is actually somewhere between a word in its own right and a grammatical formulation, since the base verb of naru, which means to become, is being modified by sokonai, which indicates a failure to do or complete the verb it modifies. For instance, you'll sometimes hear words like shinizokonai, a modified form of the verb shinu, to die, used to describe someone who the speaker thinks should have died, or yarisokonai, based on the verb yaru, to do, describing someone as a failure. As you've probably picked up on from these examples, it tends to carry a negative nuance. So, narisokonai is describing a failure to become something, or referring to something in an incomplete state, often pejoratively. At least when I fail at something and die in the game, I can keep trying again. But anyway, this is why my more literal translation refers to failed inhuman babies. The official translation here substitutes the concept of stillbirth, which, given the context, seems reasonable, except that it includes the concept of death before birth. And this precludes one possible interpretation of the Japanese, which is that this not fully formed inhuman child was born and then died in some odd corner of the chalice dungeons. That said, this strikes me as a bit of an unlikely interpretation, and stillborn is a really natural sounding and intuitive solution for how to talk about not yet complete inhuman babies that died. And one way or another, it's an unpleasant item description. Why don't we move on now to something maybe less disturbing? Organ of focal infection, one of the special materials necessary for a holy chalice ritual. A special body part from a healing church dissection made for the purpose of its exploration. The repulsive odor of decay makes for a kind of bait. By means of the additive rite, rotten scent offering, uncommon beings appear. They are often frightening, but should become the subjects of a special hunt. Okay, this item's still kind of messed up. And as I'm sure you've noticed, there are also some discrepancies with the translation here, particularly in the middle section, though in this case there is no alternative translation that I know of. To be fair, we still learn that this is a body part collected by the Healing Church, and that it's both gruesome and used for bait. But compared to the Japanese, it's not quite as clear that this item comes from dissections the Healing Church seems to have undertaken in search of some sort of truth. Also, the official English leans into the question of what the organ is used to lure, while the Japanese simply states that the repulsive scent is used as bait and nothing more. Beyond that, both here and in The Sage's Risk, the Japanese places an emphasis on scent that isn't getting across in the officially implemented English, which is interesting to me given how prevalent sensory information is in other parts of Bloodborne. Think of the power of bells and runes meant to represent sounds, or of the importance of insight and the repeated use of eyeballs as a theme, or of lines that speak of moonlit scents. I'm not sure how significant it is that some of this sensory information doesn't carry over into the English version of the game, but I do think it's interesting enough to bring up here. Anyway, taken all together, I'd say there's a bit of information here I wish had made it into the official English, even if it's arguably minor. Which brings me to the other point I wanted to make about this item, because there's another bit of relatively obscure information that I don't think is fully coming across here. The Japanese name for this item is Byouso no Zoki. Now, the latter term, Zoki, is pretty straightforward in meaning organ, as in a body part, but the former term, Byouso, is more complicated. On the one hand, my Daijisen Japanese dictionary defines this as a site in the body where an unhealthy change is taking place, which lends itself well to the interpretation of inflicted organ. On the other hand, the Japanese version of the Encyclopedia Britannica identifies this as a reference to an old medical theory. In English, this is known as focal infection theory, which is why my more literal version uses the term organ of focal infection. This theory has taken many different forms throughout history, and what little looking into this I've done indicates that it survives to a limited extent today. But the version of it that's directly alluded to in that Japanese Encyclopedia Britannica entry is the one popularized by a physician named Frank Billings. To quote Wikipedia, his case reports of tonsillectomies and tooth extractions claim to have cured infections of distant organs. That's right, this is a theory that identified the source of all sorts of illnesses throughout the body with, among other things, tonsillitis. And as you may recall from Translationborne episode 27, tonsils hold a special significance in Bloodborne. Identifying an inflammation of the human amygdales as the source of a disease that affects the rest of the body, then, could be meant to function on a metaphorical level. Remember, amygdales is an old word for tonsils, while the amygdala is a part of the human brain associated with fear, memory, and aggression. Perhaps this is an oblique way of getting at how when one loses control of their fear and aggression, when one's memories become suspect, that is the source of a bestial transformation. But even without going so far as that, I still think there's an interesting potential connection to be made here with items like the tonsil stone and creatures such as amygdala. Having said that, I want to be clear that I realize this is a relatively obscure and tenuous connection. As far as the translation is concerned, even if the official version of this item were called Organ of Focal Infection as opposed to Inflicted Organ, that would hardly have made this potential set of associations clear. Still, I do think it's something that resonates reasonably well with the themes of the game, so I wanted to discuss it. Having done that, let's turn to something else. Pthumeru All-Encompassing Holy Chalice. one of the all-encompassing holy chalices that breaks the seals in various places in the underground ruins. Holy chalice dungeons, with their seals broken by an all-encompassing holy chalice ritual, are known for changing their form every time a ritual is performed. Furthermore, Pthumeru is the name of an ancient race that built the underground ruins. They are said to have been an inhuman people who possessed knowledge holy and mysterious. And I also wanted to show the central root chalice here, which has the same text. Beyond that shared text, though, I'm interested in one particular aspect of those item names. In the official translation, these are both called root chalices, and this is actually the translation choice I find the most interesting out of both item descriptions because it represents what I see as an interesting challenge. What makes it so interesting? Well, let's take a look at the Japanese. This is actually a meaning derived from a single kanji, han, that's been attached to the term seihai, or holy chalice. Depending on context, han has a few different meanings. It can refer to something floating on the surface of water, or it can apply to something broad, both literally and figuratively, and so it's often used to mean general or generic. It can also describe water overflowing. And finally, what seems to be the primary intention here, it was chosen to represent the English prefix pan. This is the term used in the Japanese version of phrases such as Pan-Asian or Pan-Americanism. It is meant to signify a broad connection across a region or some other noun it's connected to. So one way to render the phrase han seihai into English would be to use the term pan-chalice. As with any such approach, though, this one has its advantages and its disadvantages. On the plus side, it's a term that can get across the idea that this is one chalice that unites all the different variations of chalice dungeon that exist in a region. On the minus side, I think it's a term that makes considerably more sense in hindsight than it does to someone approaching the game for the first time. After all, its name implies that it unifies all chalices, not necessarily all chalice dungeons, and since this is a completely made-up word, some may find it hard to parse upon first encountering it. That brings us to the literal translation I've settled on, the much wordier, all-encompassing holy chalice. On the one hand, I think this formulation makes it easier for a newcomer to see that this is a chalice meant to encompass all of Pthumeru, or whatever the relevant region might be. On the other hand, it's much wordier than either of the other solutions, and sure to run up against character limits. It's probably already over the character limit for an item name, and it will never fit more extensive names like Sinister Lower Pthumeru All-Encompassing Holy Chalice. So what about the official translation? Well, one advantage it has over my version is it's concise enough to fit within the item name character limit in all cases. However, it's also not the most understandable term. The idea, again, works pretty well in hindsight, because you can see how this kind of chalice gives you the root common to all chalice dungeons in a particular region. That said, its biggest strength is how well it works with the flavor of the game. Remember, whenever you enter a chalice dungeon, you start at the top and work your way down. There's also a downward progression that proceeds from one fixed dungeon to the next, since you start with the regular Pthumeru chalice, then get access to the central Pthumeru, and then the lower Pthumeru chalices. Also, you will only ever receive a root chalice like this by unlocking the lowest layer of an existing chalice dungeon. It is when you gain access to the root of a dungeon that you get a root chalice that unlocks further possibilities. Yet the flavor even goes beyond this double meaning, since given the context of the rest of the root chalice item description, the idea is meant to be that one dungeon is changing its form with every completed ritual. To me, this creepy tone rings somewhat false when paired with the idea of a pan-chalice, or all-encompassing holy chalice, though not with a root chalice. Taken together, my own inclination is to say the official version is the strongest one here. It sounds cool and works on multiple levels, even though it kind of obscures the mechanical aspect of how this item works. Which ultimately gets back to the ongoing theme of how much you want to sacrifice mechanical clarity in the interest of staying true to the fiction of a game. And that's probably why I find this to be such an interesting choice. But it's not the only one I wanted to talk about. There's one more interesting decision from the last set of lines I wanted to look at briefly. You may have noticed that while the official translation refers to Pthumerians as superhuman beings, my more literal version spoke of them only as inhuman people. This is the result of an interesting phrase in the Japanese, hito naranu hitobito. So normally, hitobito just means people. It's always plural because it's a word that involves repeated use of the kanji for person. Hitonaranu literally means not human, and it generally has a creepy feel to it. One of my top search results, for instance, brings up a collection of ancient Chinese stories related to spirits, animals, and stones. So it's interesting to see this rendered as superhuman beings. Of course, given the context that they constructed the Chalice dungeons and knew the secrets of holy mystery, the idea that these would be considered higher beings does make sense. Superhuman was probably chosen because it gets at the idea that these are beings beyond humanity, without necessarily being supernatural. And with that, I will leave you. Remember to leave a comment, question, or suggestion if you're inclined. Thanks for watching, everyone.